Top of the morning to you. Welcome to our special coverage of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. I'm Olumide Macaulay. The headlines. North Korea's Kim Jong-un visits military aircraft factory in Russia's Far East. U.S. condemns latest North Korea missile launch. Plus, President Zelenskyy set to visit the United States Capitol next week. Thank you so much for joining us. North Korean leader Kim Jong-un arrived in the town of Komsomolsk on Amur in Russia's Far East this morning and headed straight to a vast aviation plant that produces warplanes and other equipment. This is according to the news agency TASS, which also showed footage posted by Russian officials. Earlier, the regional governor and other officials met Mr. Kim on the red carpet at the town's railway station. He was whisked off to the location plant named after Soviet cosmonaut Yuri Gagarin, the first person in space. The plant produces Russia's most modern fighter jets, including the Su-35 and Su-57. The plant also manufactures civil aircraft. Regional Governor Mikhail Degtyarev wrote on the Telegram messaging app that Mr. Kim was shown facilities producing parts for the military jets as well as the civilian Superjet 100 aircraft, which Russia aims to produce without imported components. Meanwhile, Russia's Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu checked on the repair and modernization of the Pacific Fleet's nuclear submarines at a top military shipyard today, according to his ministry. Earlier this week, Mr. Shoigu took part in talks between President Vladimir Putin and North Korea's Kim Jong-un, who visited two aviation plants in the town of Komsomolsk on Amur on Friday. Shoigu checked the construction of a floating docking complex and how the fleet's nuclear submarines are being repaired and modernized at the Vezda Star plant in the town of Bolshoy Kamen. Shoigu also visited the Progress plant in the town of Arseniev, which produces Ka-57 military helicopters. Video posted on social media shows a motorcade believed to be carrying North Korean leader Kim Jong-un in Russia's Far East this morning and amidst his visit to the nation that has stirred so much concern abroad. Mr. Kim's visit to Russia has stoked U.S. concerns that a revived Moscow-Pyongyang axis could bolster Russia's military in Ukraine and provide him with, that is, Mr. Kim, with sensitive missile technology. The United States is not happy about North Korea's missile launches on Wednesday, but just an hour before leader Kim Jong-un Kim Jong-un met the president of Russia, Vladimir Putin. North Korea fired two short-range ballistic missiles into the sea off its east coast in what appeared to be the first launch to occur while Mr. Kim was abroad for a rare trip with most of his top military leaders. According to analysts, this demonstrates an increasing level of delegation and more refined control system for the country's nuclear and missile programs. The missiles were launched from near and North Korea capital of Pyongyang and flew about 650 kilometers. South Korea's Joint Chiefs of Staff condemned the launch and is viewing it as a violation of UN Security Council resolutions.
The United States condemns the DPRK's recent ballistic missile launches, as we have condemned their previous ballistic missile launches. The launches are in violation of multiple United Nations Security Council resolutions and are the latest in the series of launches that pose a direct threat to the DPRK's neighbors. They undermine regional security, and our commitment to the defense of the Republic of Korea and Japan remain ironclad.
Meanwhile, top national security officials of the United States, South Korea, and Japan held a call on Thursday to discuss the recent meeting of Russian President Vladimir Putin and North Korean leader Kim Jong-un. U.S. National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan spoke to his counterparts, Takeo Akiba of Japan and Cho Tae-yong of South Korea, reiterating cooperation towards the complete denuclearization of the Korean peninsula. And President Vladimir Zelenskyy has lauded what he describes as Ukraine's destruction of a Russian air defense system in the annexed Crimea peninsula. In his nightly video address, He made mention of the entire personnel of the security services of Ukraine and its naval forces. Ukraine struck Russian air defense systems near a town of Yevpatoria in the west of occupied Crimea in a long-range overnight attack on Thursday. Russia's defense ministry said in a statement that its air defenses had shot down 11 drones overnight over the peninsula, which Russia seized from Ukraine in 2014, but did not mention any damage. In more news about Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelenskyy, he is set to visit the U.S. Capitol next Thursday. He will not address the joint session of Congress and is also expected to meet individually with lawmakers and members of the leadership. The visit comes as Congress is weighing a White House request for additional aid to Ukraine, but its passage remains in doubt, with the GOP fiercely divided over the issue. Mr. Zelenskyy addressed a joint session last December, but opposition to Ukraine funding has grown, particularly inside the House GOP. In response to the news, hardliner Representative Eli Crane tweeted, "Is there a faster way to shut down the government?" The anticipated visit comes as part of a broader trip to the United States, as President Zelenskyy is also attending the UN General Assembly in New York next week. Washington says it's not worried that sanctions imposed on Turkish firms as part of broad action against Russia could derail Sweden's bid to join NATO. Addressing reporters on Thursday, State Department spokesperson Matthew Miller added that these sanctions are not connected in any way to the accession and should not have an impact. The Biden administration has imposed sanctions on 5 Turkish companies and a Turkish national, accusing them of helping Russia evade sanctions and supporting Moscow in its war against Ukraine.
We have a constructive, warm relationship with the Turkish government. They are an important ally of ours. The president met with President Erdogan not too long ago and reiterated that fact after the meeting. We continue to work with them to communicate that NATO accession is important for Sweden and should happen as soon as possible. And we take President Erdogan's assurances that it will happen at great value. And we don't see these as any way connected, and we don't see that in any way these sanctions should have any impact at all on that accession.
Meanwhile, 2 Russian Tu-95M strategic bombers, MS strategic bombers, have carried out a patrol flight over the neutral waters of the Barents and Norwegian Sea, according to the Russian Defense Ministry. The ministry adds that the patrol was planned and lasted about 4 hours, with fighter jets escorting the bombers. Now, let's speak now to President Emeritus, Corporate Council on Africa, former President, American Center on International Leadership, and the President of Cohen and Woods International, Mr. Stephen Hayes, who is speaking with us from Washington, D.C. in the United States. Good morning and welcome.
Good morning, Alameda. How are you?
I'm very well, thank you. Thank you for being with us.
Good.
The North Korea and Russia alliance is a major topic of concern for the allies of Ukraine. And there is talk that if it is true, and it does go ahead, that North Korea is supplying munitions to Russia, and it does share sensitive technology with, that is, the Russians share their technology with North Korea. It runs afoul of the UN Security Council's security resolutions, which forbids the sharing of nuclear science, nuclear technology, aeronautical engineering with North Korea. Is this the basis for their disapproval with the North Korea-Russia alliance?
Yeah. Well, yes, it is. I mean, there is a UN resolution, as well as other interesting sanctions and so forth against the supply of high technology, particularly high rocket technology. But frankly, I don't think either Russia or North Korea care about that at this stage. Mr. Putin needs new weaponry. They haven't been able to get it as fast internally as they would like. The North Koreans need cash. That's the base of it. But also there is, of course, the North Korean hatred for the U.S., the distrust, and so forth. So I think that there is a reality that North Korea is going to be supplying, and already, in fact, is supplying weapons to Russia, and probably at a greater rate. In the exchange, the price of that is going to be support for rocketry. The North Korean rockets have failed in many of their tests. In fact, the most recent one was a failure. So I think that there is a common need in both areas. North Korea and Russia have had a long alliance. There's talk about strengthening their alliance. I think the reality is that that's been a strong alliance in any case.
I don't want to digress into the influence of the United Nations and how important it is globally, and how vulnerable it may have been proven to be because of the Russian-Ukraine conflict. But if Russia can pick and choose what security resolutions it obeys or does not obey, then of what use is the UN Security Council? And of what use are the Security Council resolutions? If any country at any point, and if this sets a precedent for other countries to do the same, that there's no use for these bodies.
Well, that's been a debate in the United States for a long time. Having been a former consultant to the UN, I have some empathy with the United Nations and have a little bit, I think, a better understanding of its importance. I think what the UN does is provide a global, a moral voice. The fact is that it's not just Russia, but other countries have ignored UN Security Council resolutions. You also have at times, you also have a structure that if the UN can do very little with the structure of the veto, that the Security Council member, particularly the Big Five, can veto any action, so the UN cannot really take action. What it can do is state a voice that is more global than any particular country, and it does remain an important meeting ground. But the issue is the Security Council, despite its name, has its limits, and in fact, it's very limited in what it can do if there is not unanimity at the council.
The Washington, D.C. area where you are, I expect, is where President Zelenskyy will be sometime next week for a meeting with the United States President, I believe, and also for the UN General Assembly in New York City. That is in the United States, but he'll be in Washington. How are things in Washington?
Well, as we've known, this is going to be a difficult issue. However, I think there's still very strong support in Senate and House for Ukraine, but it's going to become an issue. If in fact, that we've talked about, if President Trump were to be elected, to win the nomination, and I think that's still a major question and becoming more a major question as we progress, then I think it's going to be very difficult. The support for Ukraine will be very difficult, or at least far more difficult than it is. Ukraine has an overwhelming support in the Senate. It has an overwhelming support in the House, but you have a very vocal, militant, far-right group in the Republican Party that it's just the right numbers to hold hostage Ukraine. So I think the situation is not precarious, but it's something that has to be managed very, very carefully.
How does the indictment of President Joe Biden's son, Hunter Biden, for gun possession charges, this federal indictment, affect President Joe Biden if he's dragged into it because of the impeachment inquiry that is chaired by Kevin McCarthy?
It certainly doesn't help him. That's for sure. And I think it's going to be an irritant along the way. I think it will have some effect in terms of eroding support or confidence. When you combine that with the president's age, which the Democratic leadership is putting aside, and the White House is putting aside as an issue. But the reality is it's a very big issue. And so he cannot afford to have minor or certainly external issues that don't directly affect his governance, nibbling away at the support that he has. I think the Hunter Biden issue is clearly not going away as one indictment. Will there be others? We'll see. But it's not a minor issue in regard to the election.
Does this hold implications for U.S. support for Ukraine? You've underscored that there is some sort of pushback to a certain degree, or complaining about that to a certain degree about the U.S. support for Ukraine in terms of the aid that is being promised. Is there any underlying or overreaching or palpable sentiment in the United States where you are, and as an American, that President Joe Biden and the Democrat Party is putting other interests above the United States interests? Is there, for instance, a crime wave in Washington, D.C.? We understand that murders have gone up astronomically this year when compared to other years. The Maui fires, their response to that, the Palestine incidents, President Joe Biden's belated response or absent response to that, and other issues, the crisis at the Mexico-Texas border. Is there a problem that you foresee will hold implications if it's not addressed?
Well, one answer is check to all the above that you just run through. Certainly, there are those issues. There is going to be a growing question of, and I think that is a fair question in any foreign policy debate, and I think historically there's always been a debate as how much do you support another country at war, not because they're at war, but how much money can you allot to that when you have other more critical, no, I wouldn't say more, but other critical issues that the country should address, but frankly right now is not addressing. So yes, all those are going to be questions. The Republicans will look to expose those. Some of them are, I think, valid, very valid criticisms that need to be addressed as quickly as possible. Natural disasters, I think that cannot be blamed on the president any more than the Democrats could blame it on Mr. Trump. But there are issues of response. There is a huge national debt. I think that foreign policy wise, we need to be addressing the BRICS more directly and interacting with them as well. So I think there are a lot of issues that simply are not being addressed. Now, is that the problem of the White House? Well, it's a problem of the White House, but it's not necessarily, they're not necessarily to blame. You've got a Republican group, a minor group of 20, but who can hold the House hostage, slow things down. If government closes down, which is a real threat right now because of those 20, then we have some even more serious problems. It's hard to make decisions on Ukraine, for instance, or anything else if the government is shut down. And I think people are just very, very tired of that.
If U.S. congressional support is important for Ukraine aid from the United States, it seems to be a no-brainer that certain things will be portrayed in a certain way so as to avoid unnecessary criticism. The scrutiny under which President Joe Biden is lends to the fact that he's such an important person and he is the greatest supporter of Ukraine. For instance, is he pandering to China in his Vietnamese appearance and his subsequent appearance in Alaska? He did not. He chose rather to be in Alaska than be at Ground Zero or any of the 9/11 locations, which is obviously a no-brainer that he'd be heavily criticized for that. But he did go ahead and do that and sent Kamala Harris to New York instead for the Twin Towers commemoration of 9/11, and he did not appear, not in the Pentagon, nor any of the locations where those planes hit.
So symbolism is important, and I would agree with you in that regard. What we don't know is what else is going on behind the scenes as to why he needed to be in other areas. In terms of Vietnam, it's certainly not pandering to China. I think it's the concern that everyone has globally right now, that the clouds of war are beginning to accumulate. And I think just as China, North Korea, and Russia are doing all they can to move their own agenda forward, which I think is threatening the rest of the world, there is also a common defense line that is trying to be drawn. And so the Vietnam relationship is very important to the U.S. So I think that there is a great deal of concern globally in terms of what is happening now, which goes back to your original point again of improved rocketry and science for North Korea, which hasn't been, I think, the stellar example of temperance, and thinking about them firing more missiles more accurately, I think, is a big concern. Whether that had anything to do with President Alaska, I doubt. But the issue is, I think, very serious. And I think right now we need to find a way to diffuse some of these tensions. And I'm not sure that they can be right at the moment.
Finally, Mr. Hayes, you did make a prediction sometime earlier of the state of the counteroffensive at this time of the year. Could you refresh our memories on how optimistic or pessimistic of the Ukrainians' chances in this counteroffensive, where it seems they're making some sort of headway?
They're making incremental headway. Maybe it's better and more accurate to say that they're making a lot of headway. I don't see that, and I don't think many people do either. Taking a village is good. They're advancing and so forth. But I was looking at the size of what they're dealing with. They're dealing with the four provinces, which are oblast, I should say, that are the critical to Russia's access to Crimea, are the size of Benin, almost within a few 10,000 kilometers, the size of Benin. That's a fairly sizable area to conquer again, or to retake would be the proper word. So it's something that takes time. But I did say that by October 31, we're going to know a lot more about the situation. But I think that, what I have always said, it is foolish to expect a movie ending of people suddenly triumphing and overrunning the area and winning back the territory. It's something that if the war is to continue, it's going to be a slog. Now, can we find a way that it won't continue further? There's got to be negotiations. Putin cannot afford to lose the area again. You just simply look at the map, and it's vital to their interest of getting their navy out into the Black Sea in a warm weather port. So I think it's just going to be very, very difficult. The reason that Ukraine needed to make progress was, I think, again, encouragement of financial support, which brings us back to also your other point of Zelenskyy meeting with Biden. That's going to be very important. The Europeans have held firmly behind Ukraine a lot more than, frankly, I expected, and I think more than a lot of other people expected. So I think the meeting next week is going to be critical as to what is possible. I think it's going to be very difficult to have any negotiations on it, but we'll see.
Well, thank you, Mr. Hayes. I think it's safe to say that no one has seen this movie, and no one really knows how it ends. Mr. Stephen Hayes.
Right. Exactly.
Mr. Stephen Hayes, President Emeritus, President of Cohen and Woods International, joined us from Washington, D.C. Many thanks.
Good to see you again. Thank you.
Thank you. After the break, Satellite images appears to show Wagner camp in Belarus being dismantled. Details in a moment. Please stay with us. Welcome to the sophomore stretch of today's coverage of Russian invasion of Ukraine. Recently released satellite images of a military base in the southeast capital of Belarus capital Minsk taken appears to show dismantling of tents in recent weeks, which may indicate the winding down of Wagner's base. On August 23rd, the Russian mercenary company boss Yevgeny Prigozhin and his top lieutenants were killed when a private jet he used crashed in so far unexplained circumstances, leaving the fate of his mercenaries in doubt. Images of the military base in the Mogilev region taken on July the 25th, August 25th, and September the 9th, and provided by Earth imaging company Planet Labs, appears to show the gradual dismantling of tents in the camp. In June, the Wagner Group launched a brief mutiny against the top army brass in Russia, condemned as treason by President Vladimir Putin. Belarus President Alexander Lukashenko then invited Wagner to set up operations in his country as part of a deal that ended the uprising. Kyiv Mayor Vitaly Klitschko met with Berlin Mayor and State Premier Kai Wagner on Thursday to sign a city twinning agreement between the two capitals. After a symbolic meeting at the Brandenburg Gate, Mr. Klitschko and Mr. Wagner, drove to the Berlin town hall known as the Rotes Rathaus, where they signed the agreement. With the addition of Kiev, Berlin now has a total of 18 twin cities, including Moscow. According to Berlin State Chancellery, the cooperation with the Russian capital is currently on hold due to Russia's attack on Ukraine. A section of the Crimea bridge was reopened for traffic yesterday. The Crimean bridge linking the Russian mainland with the Crimean peninsula, which Russia annexed from Ukraine in 2014, has been a target of increased air and sea drone attacks in recent months. An explosion on July the 17th on this section killed a Russian couple while their 14-year-old daughter was injured. Moscow said it was a Ukrainian attack that knocked out part of the bridge linking Russia to the Crimean peninsula. We now bring in public affairs analyst Mr. Ralph Obasoje, who speaks to us virtually from Lekki Axis in Lagos, Southwest Nigeria. Welcome to the program.
Good morning, Olumide. Nice to join you once again.
It's so good to have you, sir. Thank you for being with us. Now, if you look at the trajectory of the attacks against Crimea, or the Crimean bridge, I should say, by Ukraine, in many cases where it does not, claim responsibility, this latest attack that seemed to destroy certain air defenses for Crimea, do you think it'll result in a subsequent reply by Russia that will further exacerbate this situation?
Yeah, I think it is that is a natural expectation, because if for pundits who have been following the war, each time there was any humiliating attack by Ukraine, you found out that Russia always retaliated with more devastation. So you could have, I think you listened to Putin yesterday on Russia Today, Russia 24, and he did say he was mocking them. So it is war, and one would expect that with the sophisticated weapons, cruise missiles that the UK and the US had delivered recently to Ukraine, you would expect more of such attacks on Russian facilities. You are aware that 2 submarines that were on dry dock were similarly hit in Crimea, and the dock at Sevastopol was also hit by Ukrainian missiles. So there is no doubt that Ukraine is putting to use, good use, the missiles they have just gotten.
What do you make of
retaliations is a natural consequence.
What do you make of this strategy? Because there's much to do at the front lines for the counteroffensive. We understand that they are making some progress in the southern parts of the Axis as well as the eastern part now. Will attacking Crimea not be spreading themselves out too thin? Should they concentrate on those areas where the territory recently taken and occupied should be retaken by them?
Yes, Olumide, you and I are just watchers and bystanders. We are spectators because of our interest. We are not military experts. But you do know that for deployment, what military does all over the world is that where there are areas they feel threatened or deficient in terms of defense, they will move resources and personnel towards that area. But Ukraine itself has said they are making very slow progress. They have not been able to move rapidly. And we just watch and see what they get at, because they are clearing mines in that southern part, fringes of the territories. They are clearing mines very cautiously, and that has slowed down their movements. All right? So that is not where people should be watching. They should be watching the complications that are recently arising out of this war. I think even supporters are getting battle weary, which actually brings out to the fore again the need for people to judge instead of war. You will ask yourself, why suddenly some of the Baltic states surrounding Ukraine, why are they imposing grain ban on Ukraine itself? There are some of the military supporters, they are in the NATO alliance, and yet they woke up, led by Poland, imposing grain bans on Ukraine, when Ukraine is craving to actually evacuate all the stockpiles of grain they've not been able to export to generate some needed foreign exchange. And then you look at the impeachment move in the US. How is that going to impact this war? We are all aware that in 1 year's time, if the election fortunes change in the US, this war could come to an immediate end, which is what most of us who are peace-loving have been advocating for. They should dialogue and navigate and negotiate a peaceful way out of this war.
This side of the 21st century, it seems the world hasn't had it this bad. Post the pandemic, enter the Ukraine war, the natural disasters that are even affecting Africa now with Morocco and Libya, and the schism between North Korea and South Korea, further accentuated by this visit to Russia by North Koreans Kim Jong-un. If you could, not to play the blame game, but if you could ask of a nation to take more responsibility that will help to make things better in this Ukraine war, what will, I guess, but what will that country, which country will that be?
Like I've told you, the influence, we've said this over and over again on this platform, in your channel, the influence that the United States wield. You remember that much as he's hated, that is Donald Trump, he came online severally on international media to say, look, I will end that war within 2 days, because what is propelling NATO to provide support for Ukraine is because of American influence and American leadership. Somebody wrote, a former European Union legislator, parliament member, a lady, actually wrote on her blog to say, why the US keeps itself safe from all the dangers that could emanate from the Ukraine war. It is providing weapons, of mass destruction to Ukraine. And do you know the laughable thing? When I was listening to the reaction of the US over the Kim Jong-un's visit and the alliance they've just signed with Russia, and they were talking of consequences. You are supplying weapons to Ukraine, and you don't want any other country to exercise the same liberty to supply weapons to Russia. There is no equity. These inequities does not augur well, even for the war. Nobody should supply weapons to any of the sides. And that is where the UN that you mentioned, that is where they are, how will I call it? Is it inaction? It's very worrisome. Because in other conflicts, the UN will come out strongly to try to mediate some truce and some peace. The UN has been, Guterres has been absent. We all know that. We know those who pay those who pay how will I call it? They taste the tune. Those who pay the piper, they take the tune. Yeah. You will wonder, in a conflict of this magnitude, where innocent civilians are suffering. Children have been displaced. More than 3,000 schools have been closed. More than 5,000 clinics, health centers have been damaged or closed. The UN has been quiet. It's worrisome. So, like I told you, it's basically the US and China, that can sit down and then say, hey, enough is enough. But the weariness you are seeing in the NATO alliance with Baltic states who have been supporting the war, supporting Ukraine, are imposing grain ban. That shows you that the kind of dissension will continue. Why are they doing that? Because those countries also want to protect their own farm produce. They also produce grain, a lot of grain, and a lot of wheat. So if you then evacuate Ukrainian wheat through those land corridors, it then means that you will sell Ukrainian wheat first before you sell their own wheat. I think that is where their own action, self-preservation and economic protection is what those countries are doing. And that could actually affect the alliance as we go on. Let's just watch.
So let's call a spade a spade. A lessening or withdrawal of support from the United States for the Ukrainian cause can effectively end this war or sway the war in the way of Russia, regardless of Germany's support, NATO support, and the European Union Commission support?
I can tell you that those countries will not do anything once the US is doing nothing. And when you get to this stage, there's what we call a soft landing. You don't expect the US to just withdraw support abruptly and don't try to get something. They want to also cover their own humiliation and protect Ukraine a bit. So they can do it by saying, okay, Russia, let's talk. Ceasefire first, maintain status quo, while we negotiate towards status quo ante bello. Just maintain status quo now, then we negotiate status quo ante bello, which is what it was from the beginning. But like I said, between Minsk I and Minsk II, pragmatic negotiators will go back to Minsk II, which is more, which is fairer to both sides. The UN has always taken action to protect ethnic minorities, the way they protected the Kurds in Turkey and Iraq and Syria, the way they've protected ethnic Armenians in Mongolia. They should do the same thing for ethnic Russians in Ukraine. That is where this conflict came from. Apart from military threat, where the US and NATO were arming Ukraine to try to take back Crimea and Donetsk, which was what escalated the conflict. The banning of the Russian language, the hounding of ethnic Russians, which are actually either at 50% or majority in these territories that Russia has occupied. That should be given a consideration. Nobody can seek to drive this population back into Russia. And like I said, during the disintegration of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, who drew the new borders, did the UN participate to then say, okay, if there's this sudden disintegration, where would it be the border? There is no way Russia will give up the real firepower it has. That is the Black Sea Fleet in Crimea. They will not give it up. You remove the Black Sea Fleet, where you have all the nuclear-powered submarines, you have all the destroyers, you have the Black Sea Fleet is akin to the US 7th Fleet. That is a quick intervention that force that Russia has. They won't give it up. And so if there are majority Russians in Crimea, why does the US, if the US could lead a global coalition that balkanized the Balkans, that is the former Yugoslavia, and split them into tiny countries, okay, and accepted and recognized the new countries. Why can't that be done for the former Soviet territories? To say, if there are things that are pricking the Russians and making the Russians feel threatened, why don't we look at how we can then accommodate them? A peaceful world is basically better for you and I and for everybody.
Indeed.
But what should add to stop the sufferings of civilians in Ukraine?
Yes, that suffering has led to the death of thousands of people, including children. And it's a very dire situation. It's ironic that accession to certain conditions which the European Commission is saying have to be met before Ukraine is allowed to join the EU, are some of that, like such as protection of ethnic minorities, are some of those issues which President Putin was highlighting. And you mentioned the misagreements, but we'll leave it there.
Yes.
And we thank you for your insight and your comprehensive analysis, Mr. Rafa
Thank you,
who joined us.
I love your smiles at times.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, and do have a nice day.
You too. When we come back, President Putin accepts rifle from Kim Jong-un and an invitation to visit North Korea. Details in a moment. Please stay with us. Welcome back. In the final stretch of today's coverage of Russian invasion of Ukraine, Pope Francis' envoy, Cardinal Matteo Zuppi, had open and cordial talks in Beijing with a Chinese government official on the need to find ways to achieve peace in Ukraine. That's the way the Vatican described the encounter with China's special envoy for Eurasian affairs, Li Hui. The two sides underlined the need to combine efforts to encourage dialogue and find paths that lead to peace, according to the Vatican. And now we find ourselves often having to face business encounters concerning the war in Ukraine. And joining us to underscore those issues is Ini John Mekwa, Channels Television business correspondent. Ini, good morning.
Good morning.
President Zelenskyy will be heaving a sigh of relief for those countries that have decided to stay with the expiration of the ban on the Ukrainian agricultural products that is ending today by the EU. So the EU ban on import of Ukrainian agricultural products ends today.
Yeah,
What's the latest?
Today. It ends today, and the EU countries, the neighboring countries, haven't really said anything. But I guess Ukraine is going ahead to be sure, because of course they're on the losing end if the ban that ends today is not extended for instance, because we know that it was banned so that the goods, the agricultural goods, remember the farmers in the neighboring countries and all of their complaints and all of that, so that they will have markets, because the Ukrainian grains were competing with them, So with this ban now, it means that Ukrainian grains can go in to those neighboring countries. That's another competition. So we haven't heard from them. That's the farmers and the government of Hungary and all of that, all those neighboring countries, Poland,
Bulgaria.
Exactly, Bulgaria and all of them. They haven't said anything yet because it just ends today. But I guess the Ukrainian minister just has to go ahead to say there's no need to extend this ban because, of course, they've had to feel the pinch for a while. And even though they're looking they have alternatives to exporting their grains, it's never really the same, because the Black Sea, which is their major source of export or avenue of export, has been, even the alternative has also been affected. I think there were some blasts at the Danube ports and all of that for some time. So all of these are being threatened, and they are just trying to ensure that they have a means of revenue for the country.
Exactly. It's a fine balancing act. You want to protect the revenue and income of your farmers, and you also want to maintain support for Ukraine.
Yeah, you want to have good diplomatic relationship, especially since
the Russian invasion.
In spite of that, but it's a difficult one. Just looking at it from afar, it's a very difficult one for them because those farmers, a lot of them in all those Poland and Hungary and all of that, that's what they feed on. They need the market. They really need it. We don't hear of them doing a lot of exports. Ukraine is the one that does a lot of exports because obviously they have commercial quantity to send out. But unfortunately, the avenue to send it out is being threatened on so many fronts. So they're looking for markets. The farmers are also looking for markets. The countries are looking for revenue.
And finally, Ukraine and Moldova are shaking hands again on liberalization of freight transport for 2 years.
Yeah, well, it's what's good for the goose is not good for the gander, and all of that. So while these other countries are trying to protect their farmers, they do not want Ukrainian grains to get into their country so that it doesn't take away their market.
Yes.
Moldova, the second poorest country in the EU, is anxious to open its arms and its country, to everything. Perhaps they don't have a lot to lose when it comes to grain. So they had this agreement removing tariffs and duties and levies for import and export.
Right.
In and out of Moldova. And I think they've had it for a couple of years, and I think 2 years before now, it's supposed to expire. And so they've seen the benefit. So now that Ukraine is looking for a way to get its grain out, they have offered, drivers can go through both countries as Ukraine and Moldova. They don't need to have permits.
Right.
They don't need to do any paper processing, and all of that, just to encourage more movement between Moldova and Ukraine. So it's a good one for Ukraine, also good for Moldova, because, they don't really have a lot of grain that is being threatened right there. So Ukraine can sell its grain in Moldova and through Moldova, and Moldova can also make a lot of gains.
Sounds like a good deal. Thank
Yes,
you,
it does.
Innie.
Thank
John
you.
Merker, Channel Television business correspondent.
Thank you.
And finally, on the program today, the Kremlin says Russian President Vladimir Putin has gratefully accepted North Korea leader Kim Jong-un's invitation to visit his country. This was after the two men held a rare summit in Russia's Far East. Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov told reporters that Mr. Kim's visit to Russia will continue for several days, and added that Mr. Putin has now returned to Moscow from the Far East, where he showed Mr. Kim round Russia's most modern space launch facility. And that's where we leave it for today's special coverage of Russian invasion of Ukraine. Many thanks to our guests, our producers, and to you, our viewers, for watching. Have a good weekend. I'm Olumide Mkoro.